Hello ladies and gentlemen, I am SidAlpha, and I know that it has been an exceptionally long time since I actually produced any form of real game critique on my channel, so I decided that if there was one thing that could make me dust off the old critics cap, it would be Battletech. Even though this review is extremely late, I still wanted to get it out there for you all because in the midst of all the nonsense going on within the industry, actual good games I think should be celebrated more often. So first off, I know that there will be a good number of people who don't know the lore of Battletech, which could be a little off-putting or daunting for some people, but the game doesn't require any prior experience in the Battletech universe in order to enjoy yourself, so I wouldn't let that be something to put you off. For my part, I'll avoid talking too much about the lore and history here because quite frankly, even just a primer on the story arc of the Battletech universe would take up several half-hour episodes in its own right. The number of stories that already exist in the Battletech universe are already extremely extensive, which is as it should be. Battletech itself has been in existence for over 30 years and has maintained a loyal fan base throughout all of that time. So instead, let's focus on the game itself, which thankfully you don't need to be a lore master to be able to integrate well with the game. And while normally I do go through a more in-depth rundown of the options menu in the beginning, I'm going to just leave you with a basic impression of the options menu itself as opposed to a page-by-page breakdown because this game does have a lot of different elements to it that need to be covered. Each one doesn't have too much to it, but in order to properly present the game, we do have to go over them at least briefly. The options menu is exactly what I would expect from a development team like Harebrained Schemes. It is robust and reasonably well designed with everything that you might expect. There aren't any surprises within it, and it shows that they did give it some attention, and that is always a good thing to see. A development team that shows enough care and attention to detail to slog through the drudgery of developing a well-thought-out options menu bodes well for the game itself. Now, the game itself is a fairly straightforward turn-based tactical game with giant mechanical death machines. If you're a fan of Battletech and are expecting a lore-rich experience, this game might be a little bit disappointing for you as the story within the game is actually pretty cookie-cutter when it comes to Battletech. Ruler of a noble family gets overthrown by evil relative and has to go into hiding for several years before returning in, making a bid to regain their position while employing the use of a mercenary, which is where you come in, with whom the entire campaign could never have succeeded. It checks all the major boxes of a Battletech story arc, but doesn't really do much to innovate in terms of branching out or spending too much time developing some of the characters. Now, don't get me wrong, the game starts off very strong with excellent voice acting that helps the player develop an affinity for the characters, a fact that had me vowing a horrific and painful death at the business end of an autocannon for a certain villain that revealed herself during the first mission, but after that, there really wasn't much to endear you to the characters. There is a decent amount of dialogue and some backstory to find out for many of the NPCs, but the story in many areas feels underdeveloped. Although, when you look back through the history of the stable of mechware games we've gotten on PC in the past, and this game feels downright Shakespearean when compared against those games in terms of story and character development. The game does make use of voice acting, but it's highly selective, instead relying on text for the vast majority of the game, which is a fairly common thing to see with a Harebrained Schemes video game. But I feel the extreme over-reliance on text-based dialogue detracts from the overall experience here. It's a fun throwback to bygone days, but voice acting brings the characters to life so much better than text that I don't really think it's a positive design choice. But the story is serviceable enough, and as I said, is far better than what we've gotten with previous mechware titles on PC. And given the cookie-cutter nature and the heavy reliance on text over voice acting, it still gets the job done very well. The primary characters in the story are decently developed, and the story does do a good enough job to keep you tuned into the Battletech universe that, even if you've never even heard of Battletech, you won't have any difficulty getting around. Next, I want to take you through the different elements of the out-of-combat game itself before we talk about the combat system, because, let's face it, I'm a gigantic asshole that way, and I derive a sort of perverse delight in making you sit here and suffer through my talking for an extended period of time about aspects and game mechanics that many of you probably don't give a rat's ass about. The different aspects of the out-of-combat game are easily enough divided up into different segments within the game's interface, so we can just go through them individually. In most segments, there will be various NPCs that you can interact with through text-based dialogue, as I stated previously, but we're going to skip all that for the sake of not retreading ground in terms of the story. That said, let's just run down the line. First off, we have the Argo herself. This is a Star League-era civilian mobile base that was originally designed as a mobile habitat for deep space exploration. You recover this as part of the campaign, and as to be expected, you use it as your mercenary company's new home. From the Argo tab in the main interface, you have the hiring hall and the system store. This is, as you might expect, where you go to buy and sell equipment and mechs. Prices will vary depending on the reputation you have with whatever faction controls the system, and mechs will only be available for purchase once you begin reaching friendly or ally status with those factions. Now, each system will also have different equipment as well, so it's a good idea to check for plus and double plus items in each system you visit, as these are upgraded versions of their base counterparts that have a range of bonuses from accuracy improvements, decreased heat, or increased damage. You also have the hiring hall, which is where you will go to pick up replacement pilots. This is something that you will not want to find yourself in a position of doing often, which you'll find out once we go into the pilot leveling. And the next area is the Command Center, which is where you go to choose from any available MERCnet contracts. These are displayed for the current system you're in and for nearby systems either 1 or 2 jumps away. And once you select a contract, you have different options to choose from in contract negotiation. This allows you to customize based on your wants or needs, whether it be funds, guaranteed salvage from the battle, or increased reputation with the faction issuing the contract. I think it's worth noting that this brings up the fact that the game is non-linear when it comes to non-storyline missions. The game makes use of procedural generation to a certain extent that we'll circle back to later, and it also allows you the freedom to take as little or as much time as you want running side missions in between main story missions. For the majority of the story missions, there is a significant enough difficulty spike that investing time taking side contracts is a necessity. The next is the Barracks, which is where you go to manage the leveling of your mech warriors. And this is handled through 4 main stats. We have gunnery, piloting, guts, and tactics, which the core premise behind those I think are pretty self-explanatory, so I won't waste your time on those specifically. And within each of these 4 stats are a series of abilities. Each stat has 2 abilities within its progress tree, and each mech warrior can learn up to 3 of these activatable abilities in total, which allows you a certain amount of customization, but it also means that you must pay attention to what abilities you're assigning to which pilots. Again, this allows for a fair amount of customization with the pilots, especially when taking into account that different mechs and loadouts also complement different playstyles, which are encouraged through the use of these activatable abilities. So you might have a close-in brawler mech with a bulwark or juggernaut abilities on the guts skill list. Bulwark itself is a passive ability that grants the pilot 50% to their guarded levels when they remain stationary for that round, and the Juggernaut ability makes it so when a successful melee attack is made, the enemy gets knocked back so hard they literally go back in initiative phase, making them act later in the round. This can be extremely damaging and can be used strategically to make certain that additional mechs on your side are able to act against that mech, hopefully stripping it of additional weapons, knocking it prone, or even taking it out of the fight altogether. This adds some strategic decision making into even how you develop your mech warriors, and it's a good thing to see as Battletech has always been a very strategic style of game. The next area is the Mech Bay, which for longtime MechWarrior fans, this is an addition that likely would have caused riots in the streets if it didn't exist. Now in here, as the name suggests, you maintain your stable of battle mechs. You can upgrade the Argo to be able to hold a total of 18 active battle mechs at any given time, but quite honestly, this is entirely unnecessary given how the game's mechanics ended up working out. I can see that the developer's intentions here were for you to be able to outfit different lances of mechs with different loadout types in order to handle different situations, but the actual gameplay versus what they intended here means it was great in theory, but it really wasn't necessary. However, within here you can also repair your mechs, replace lost limbs or equipment, or design custom loadouts for your mechs. And I really would recommend you spend some time in here studying the different loadout types of the different mechs that you pick up, as well as make sure to replace standard base equipment with their plus or double plus variants. This would actually be a good time to point out that the out-of-combat system does make use of a time-based mechanic where every month you have to pay for maintenance on your active battle mechs as well as pay for your mech pilots. They are mercenaries after all, and as such tend to not really be very happy if they don't get paid. And when you are going through the different menus and making decisions, time does not advance, so you don't need to feel any kind of rush in doing anything, but be aware that traveling from system to system takes time, and refitting or repairing your battle mechs, as well as healing injured pilots or upgrading your Argo, takes time to complete as well, so you do have a financial resource management that you have to be aware of. This is a little difficult in the early game, but gets easier once you are more established, and while it will always be something to be mindful of, you'll at least get to the point where if you consistently do well in your contracts, it's not that great of a concern. The next is the engineering section, where you decide on upgrades for the Argo. Each one grants some form of passive bonus, whether it be to decrease time traveling from jump ship to planet, decrease time for injured pilots to make a recovery, decrease time needed to refit or repair battle mechs, recreational upgrades that increase morale, or training modules to help level up replacement pilots faster. Each of these upgrades make dealing with general maintenance within the game take less time and therefore cost less credits, which is something that every mercenary will always keep an eye on. This is through the lessening of the impact of time lapse and negative events. The upgrades for the Argo are expensive, but well worth it overall. The next zone is the navigation room, which will allow you to plot jump courses to manually travel to other systems, and the game actually has a surprising number of other star systems, and with contracts being available in most of those systems, it doesn't hurt to take a break from the main storyline and go do some exploring, especially as there are some areas that might have weapons or mechs that aren't available anywhere else. There are some systems that by default you are locked out of from being able to travel to, but there is a modding community, and if that interests you, word is there is already a mod out there that allows you to travel to those systems that would otherwise be locked out. Lastly, there's also the Captain's Quarters, where you can customize the logo and paint scheme of your battle mechs, check out the reputation status of different factions, and also check on the disposition of your finances. All of this is fairly standard and not really worth going into any form of depth into. And then there's the combat, the meat of the game, and it's pretty damn awesome, but with a great big asterisk on the awesome, and let me tell you why. First, the combat is turn-based, which makes a great deal of sense for fans of the genre, and when you look at the game mechanics employed, the game is a straight-up tactical strategy game that uses the tabletop game as a baseline for its own mechanics. Now, in the combat, you direct your lance of mechs against your enemy forces, and the game takes into account things like rough terrain, cover, water, high thermal areas, radioactive areas, and other environmental factors, as well as high ground versus low ground and line of sight. Now, at first glance, the combat system doesn't look at all complicated, but trust me when I say that the game is very deceptive in that manner. When firing, you can choose which weapons you want to fire, and this is based on a few different factors, the first being heat. You will build heat as you fire your weapons, and while ballistic weapons rely on ammunition and build very little heat, missile weapons will build a moderate amount of heat, and laser weapons, while not requiring ammunition, will build a great deal of heat depending on the individual weapon. The next factor is percent to hit. The game's combat makes use of a hit percentage that can be modified based on range to target, whether or not they've moved, whether or not there's cover, rocky terrain, or if they have any movement or guard modifiers that will decrease chance to hit or damage taken. So instead of discussing this in nebulous terms, let's go through some of the different aspects more specifically. When you move, assuming you move far enough, you gain a status called evasive, which will decrease the chance of your being hit. Now, you can have multiple levels of each modifier, and when you're struck with weapons, you lose a certain amount of that particular attribute until it is completely depleted for that round. There is also cover, which also decreases your chance to hit, so generally cover is a very advantageous thing to have, obviously. Now, there's also the guarded and entrenched status effects. These don't decrease the opponent's chance to hit you, but what they do instead is they make it so if you are hit, there is a negative modifier on the amount of damage you take from each individual weapon. There is also unsteady, which you gain when you have taken enough shots within a single round. This is a cumulative build, and it can be decreased either with the use of specific activatable abilities, simply having a round go by where you don't take any additional fire, or it can be greatly reduced by standing your ground for that round as opposed to moving. This is important because if your pilot loses their feet with their mech, it topples over, which will cause additional damage to the mech, it will injure your pilot, and it will also run the risk of your pilot being knocked unconscious. One other thing happens when a mech is knocked prone, and that is that it allows the opposing mechs to make called shots to specific regions of that downed mech, like the cockpit, for example, in order to either completely incapacitate the mech or kill the pilot. Now, in addition, you also have the activatable abilities that I mentioned before, such as Precision Strike. Now, Precision Strike allows you to make a called shot on an enemy mech even if it's still standing. Now, these abilities cost morale to use, which is replenished rather easily if you're doing well in battle, but not so much if you're losing. It is a mechanic that is interesting and one that I've seen used before, but it is also a mechanic that makes combat easier for you if you're winning, but it can compound the difficulty when you're losing. Now, the reason for that is the enemy mechs can and will make use of the same abilities that the player is provided, and while that does add a nice bit of challenge, I still feel that it is a system that is difficult to balance, and I don't think they have the mix quite right here. And then I feel it only fair that I talk briefly about some of the aspects of the game that I don't like. One thing is the percentage to hit and the general randomness of combat. Now, it's difficult when you're dealing with a strategy-based game like this and you make use of an RNG system. The law of averages dictates that over time everything will even out, but that means little when dealing with combat on a case-by-case basis. There will be some that will complain that there's no skill involved in the combat, and those people would be correct. The combat itself relies on an RNG system, but also bear in mind that this is a strategy game after all. That would be to compare this to a game where player skill being directly necessary would be a bit like comparing Fortnite to chess. Now, in chess, you don't necessarily complain that it takes no personal skill for a knight to capture a rook. No, there is no skill to the combat. The skill lies in the positioning of the tactics involved to place oneself into an advantageous position. But the RNG system also makes the difficulty a little inconsistent. Now, I remember going into one combat early on, and I felt a twinge of genuine fear as I was in a lance of mixed medium and light mechs, and I ended up facing a lance of mediums and heavies. Now, by all rights, I had no business being in that fight, and I should have gotten wiped off the map, but then in the first round of combat, I didn't get one, nor two, but I ended up getting 3 headshots on the enemy mechs, decapitating them, which kills their pilots and is a one-shot against vastly superior opponents. And this was merely due to the RNG mechanic of the game. And unfortunately, I really don't have much of an answer for that to make it better in any way. I think it's just one of the benefits and drawbacks of a system that doesn't involve direct player interaction in regards to aiming and firing within a game like this. Also, the game makes use of procedural generation for the different contracts within the game, and while this does allow a tremendous amount of playtime within the game, the procedural generation seems to be purely based on drop weight, which can end up putting you into a situation of severe difficulty spikes well outside of the advertised difficulty rating of that particular contract. Now, they have since patched the game to limit the chances of that happening, and it has helped a great deal, but it will still be a possibility from time to time. Also, there is the limitation that no matter what, you can only drop with a single lance of mechs, which is a little disheartening. I know that it is a limiter to keep a player from becoming massively overpowered and fielding a full company, which in Battletech parlance is comprised of 3 lances, but damn it, if I want to drop with a full dozen Highlanders, then I should be granted the ability to do so. But all complaints about some aspects and features of the game aside, as far as a Battletech strategy game goes, it really is extremely good. It honestly makes me think that this game is what would happen if you took the original Battletech tabletop RPG and combine it with Mech Commander and Mech Commander 2. It's a bit rough around the edges and I might not be able to do everything I want with it, but the game is quite good and ripe for possibilities for story expansions, and I hope that we do get some DLC for the game down the line. And while I know that I haven't covered everything this game has to offer, namely multiplayer, I wanted to focus on the single-player aspects of the game, as a multiplayer gameplay isn't radically different in terms of overall mechanics. And yeah, it's a pretty damn good game, and yes, this review is extremely late, but as I keep saying, a promise is a promise. So this has been a look at Battletech by Harebrained Schemes. I hope you saw something worthwhile, and as always, please do let me know what you think about all of this down in the comments below. And once again, ladies and gentlemen, I am SidAlpha, and I'll see you next time.